probably the first hybrid colloquium that we have organized in a long while. Yeah? And it's also very nice to be able to introduce Adriana Marais. Adriana has been for many years in my group as a master student, as a PhD student, and then as a postdoc. And thanks to her, we started getting interested in quantum effects in biological systems. Yeah? And she wrote her PhD about that, and then started looking into quantum effects in astrobiological systems. Yeah? And he enjoyed working with me so much that she decided to go to Mars. just to keep a safe distance. So that's why I'm very happy that she's back in Stellenbosch with us today. A few years ago, Adriana founded a foundation called Proudly Human, and I'm sure you will say something about that just now. But she's also a director. Sorry, I read this because I don't know it by heart. The director of the Foundation for Space Development Africa, and she's working also with the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, also on issues about space and life in extraterrestrial parts of the world. Yeah? And she teaches, she's a faculty member at the Singularity University. So Adriana, thank you very much for taking the trouble to come to Stellenbosch. And sorry that the beginning was a little bit chaotic, but let's say it's ESCOM's fault. Adriana, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Francesco. Let's check everything's good here.
Sorry, Adriana.
Are we online? Because I'm not hearing Ilya.
Yes,
Do you want
yes.
to give us an indication that all is good?
Yes, we are online, but we're seeing your presentation screen with the next slide. Can you hear me, Adriana?
Ilya, are you able to hear me? Should I go ahead?
Now I can hear you, and now we're trying to see where is your presentation.
Ilya, are you there?
Yes.
Can you hear Adriana?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I do not see Adriana's screen yet.
Oh, it says that sharing is paused. Sorry.
Ah, Hugo, where is Hugo?
Okay, now we again could see your slides in the presentation mode or in presenter mode. So I could see your next slide. Sorry.
Why did it do that? Is anyone? But no, it's the recovered version. Sorry. Because PowerPoint crashed. It's not. But that was the recovered slide version. So that's the recovered version, but now the real one's not popping up. Do you want to just do that? So it's still present. Oh no, but in the Zoom call, it's still present in mode. Does anyone want to try and help here? I don't know.
Sharing it on Zoom or not?
It's not acting correctly.
Okay, and now we are in business. Now,
Okay, that's better.
let's see. Now we need to. Yeah, let's see if that works. Yeah, that works.
Is it good enough?
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Thanks for everyone who's here in person, and hi to everyone online. And thank you very much to Francesco for having me here today. Yes, I have a background in quantum biology and even looking towards the building blocks of life in space and quantum effects there. And I've been busy with some other projects in the interim since leaving academia a few years ago. So I'm here again as a call for collaborators. So for those of you who were looking to relax and enjoy the talk without a lot of technical detail, you're in the right place. For those of you who would have been eager for more technical detail, let's chat, because that's what I'm here to do, talk about formalizing some of the ideas that I will share here today. So let's get started. So let's talk about the progress in the space industry. Now, I know we've all been busy with a lot of other things during the last few years, to say the least. So maybe we haven't all followed the leaps and bounds that have been happening in space exploration. And maybe you didn't know that we had an unprecedented situation of traffic on the way to Mars during the pandemic. So in 2020, we had 3 missions launched from Earth to Mars. That was the UAE orbital mission, which arrived successfully in orbit around Mars 2021. We had the Chinese rover, and let's give congratulations to China in the first attempt launching an orbiter and a rover, which is now active on the surface of Mars, the Tianwen-1. And then we had NASA with the 9th, I think it is, successful landing on the surface of Mars with the Perseverance rover, which you see in the picture here. So human presence off-world is becoming increasingly realistic. Of course, we have had decades of humans living in space since the first Russian space stations in the early 70s, and then the continuous presence of humans in the International Space Station for the last 20 years. But let's talk about beyond Earth orbit. Of course, we went to the moon during the Apollo era in the 60s and 70s. Some of us may have been around to enjoy the excitement and inspiration that came from that era. But it's been a while, right? So we are looking forward to the Artemis mission with NASA in collaboration with ESA, JAXA, and the Canadian Space Agency, scheduled for the first cargo missions in 2024 and the first crewed missions back to the moon in 2025. However, we've seen that the SLS rocket did fail to launch a couple of times, including 2 weeks ago. So interesting the role that the private sector is now playing in launching, because we know SpaceX is flawlessly launching satellites regularly by now, and they are also a part of the Artemis mission back to the moon in terms of being the builders for the lander. So that's the return to the moon program, perhaps in the next few years. I don't know if you heard the announcement that the ISS is planned to be deorbited, burn up and land in the Pacific Ocean in 2031, very unglamorously. But we do know that China has launched their own space station recently. So will we see the private sector launching another collaborative space station in the meantime, or will the Chinese be the only occupants of low Earth orbit? This all remains to be seen, but that's the situation. With that, China has announced that they will send crewed missions to Mars in 2033. And as the only country to have landed on the far side of the moon with tech recently, a few years ago, I would say they may be on schedule for that. So will anyone get to Mars with crewed missions before China is the question. Perhaps SpaceX. We know Elon Musk's dates can be ambitious, but he was planning to launch crewed missions on the Starship in the next less than a decade, but let's see. And it's a great opportunity for SpaceX to test the landing aspects of the infrastructure for getting to Mars on the moon in collaboration with NASA as a paying customer. So along with the fleets of satellites that SpaceX has recently launched, their revenue looks guaranteed for the next few years and on track to be part of the crewed missions to Mars in the next 10 years. The UAE has announced in 2017 a 100-year plan to build a city on Mars. And when you fly over or land in Dubai, I think we can all agree that if anyone's going to build a city in a desert like Mars, then probably the UAE can do it. So that's a summary of the major announcements there. But for now, let's go back in time a bit. And we know that Sputnik was the first satellite launched from Earth in 1957. But perhaps less well known is that a year later, NASA launched the Vanguard 1, the first solar-powered satellite. And just a comment there, where would we be unless we had been developing solar-powered technologies for space since the 1950s? So as early as the 70s, people started realizing that the emission of greenhouse gases was going to become a problem for global warming, climate change, etc. Although only recently have we seen real talk, if not action, towards mitigating that. If we hadn't been developing solar power for space because of the challenges that exist in obviously burning fossil fuel and other kind of powered systems when we leave Earth, where would we be today in terms of options, in terms of power generation on commercializable scales? So that's just one example of the kinds of technologies that are designed for extreme places that turn out to be incredibly useful later on for reasons that we may not have anticipated. And that's one of the primary reasons why we need to explore space. So let me just go through this chronological list of a selection of life support systems and when they were first developed. And here we will see a predominance of Soviet missions, in fact, as well as the recent Chinese ones. So perhaps a communist or socialist-based system is more geared towards resource efficiency than perhaps other systems. Anyway, again, a comment, but let's look through. So we know about Sputnik. That was battery powered, in fact, in 1957. I've just described the Vanguard 1 first solar powered the next year. Then we had Yuri Gagarin in orbit, 1961. And here we already had carbon dioxide scrubbing systems within the Vostok mission. Obviously, as humans breathe, the carbon dioxide needs to be removed. So basic systems already developed as early as 61. And then the first nuclear-powered satellite by NASA in 1961, another alternative method of powering missions in space. So this is typically through radioisotope thermoelectric generation of power through some kind of radioisotope, typically uranium or plutonium. Humans to the moon during Apollo. Again, we saw another stage in development of life support systems. So there we actually had hydrogen fuel cells. So the generation of fresh water, as well as the production of power from hydrogen and oxygen in the Apollo missions. Of course, the space suits that enabled Gagarin to come back safely down to Earth. A similar kind of spacesuits enabling obviously breathable and protection from radiation, etc., was used by the Apollo astronauts. Then in one of the Salyut space stations in 1982, we saw the first plant growing in space. I'll mention a bit more about that soon. The first flowering plant, in fact. Some poor little rice plants were planted before that, but that's considered the first real growth because the crop went to flower. Oxygen generation in orbit, again by the Soviets in 1987 on Mir. So that is through electrolysis, so the separation of hydrogen and oxygen from the water molecule. And then water recovery in orbit. So a nice way of saying processing urine back for drinking water has been around as early as 1989. And that is routinely how water is managed in the space station now through such water reclamation systems or water recovery systems. And then amazingly, if you missed it, the Chinese have actually grown crops on the surface of the moon. I think only for a couple of weeks, but some growth was observed before the plant died of cold, of some power system failure or running out of batteries. So that's a selection of a chronology of life support systems looking back in history. So the categories that we need to consider when thinking about resources off-world, at least the fundamental categories of resources, are power, water, food, and communication systems. All other functionality kind of depends on the availability of these basic resources. I'm grouping air and water together, in fact, because as we know, electrolysis can provide oxygen from water. So the convenient part about doing thought experiments, which we'll engage in now in a moment for off-world settlements, is that we get this kind of encapsulation of these systems under some kind of settlement dome. So in that way, although it's not a closed system, of course, we will be using so-called in situ resources, wherever the extreme environment may be, i.e. extracting atmospheric or surface-based whatever resources of whatever types. This gives us a way to actually quantify how much resources are required for a given number of people, for example, performing a set of tasks in a specific place, in a way that we've never really done for a country or the whole planet either. We haven't really analyzed exactly how much resources we need in systems on Earth, perhaps because they are not as closed and convenient to kind of monitor and observe or control as such a thing as a settlement on another planet. Anyway, I'll expand on that thinking in a moment, but let's go through these categories. So power, we have a range of power systems. These are looking a lot more disheveled after actually going to the moon and back, but these are the hydrogen fuel cells that were on the Apollo mission, 3 of them, mainly powering the computing systems and control systems for the mission. So starting with the most fundamental way of generating power, as the sun does through nuclear power, missions that leave the solar system, for example, would have to be powered on non-solar power systems, so radioisotope thermoelectric generators that basically just turn the heat from radioactive decay into electricity are quite robust, not very many moving parts, way to generate power for missions beyond Earth or far from the sun or a sun. Fuel cells, solar, next most fundamental. If you're not going to generate energy like the sun does, you can extract energy from or absorb energy from the sun. So we saw solar powered space technologies as early as 1958. Fuel cells were next, and various different fuels can be stored or produced somehow or manufactured or brought along and be used to generate power, for example, a hydrogen fuel cell, but of course biofuels could also be utilized for fuel cells to generate electricity. And then batteries I put last because for me, these are the most difficult to imagine manufacturing beyond Earth, for example, even on Earth, when we talk about renewable energies. Are batteries really in that category? Can we do better in terms of energy storage? And so regenerative fuel cells, I believe, are a more sophisticated way of storing and generating power, but I'll elaborate on that. So power is fundamental to all other processes. If you want to generate water, you're going to need power. If you're going to perform electrolysis to generate air, you need power. If you're going to grow food, you need power. So without power, nothing interesting happens, whether we're talking about the universe or some off-world settlement or building a university at Stellenbosch. Power is fundamental. So redundancy is critical. When your access to power is a life and death scenario, like for us here, it's not quite all the time. So redundancy is critical. That's the power section. So this I got a picture of. This is the original water reclamation system on the Mir space station, which was auctioned for a lot of money recently. So that's the picture of basically the toilet pipes for the liquids anyway, and water. So critical. Let's have a look back. So yeah, in the universe, hydrogen and oxygen are in the top 3 most abundant elements. So luckily H2O is also rather abundant in the solar system, we know, not in liquid form, but certainly in ice form. And yeah, this is obviously a critical resource for life. And so maybe not coincidentally, these are abundant elements that can mostly be extracted in situ wherever we may be in the solar system. So electrolysis can be used to generate air, and also, as I said, fuel cells, like solid state regenerative fuel cells, can store energy by performing electrolysis and then generate energy by producing water through the process. Yeah, you can combine those in one fuel cell. So water and air we kind of couple together. So this was the first plant to flower in space, Arabidopsis, I'll put the name there because I didn't remember it, but this was actually the first plant to have its entire genome sequenced, and it has quite a short life cycle, so it became the kind of prime plant to study when it was the only genome to be sequenced. And yeah, we saw that decades ago being flowered in one of the Soviet space stations. So yeah, food, okay, casually collect all kinds of biomass basically under the food category, but of course biomass can be used for power, as I said, for biofuel, and biological systems can also be used to produce nitrogen, for example, or other kinds of compounds. When you start to look at the microbial populations processing your organic waste, a lot can actually be done with microbial processes in terms of generating, for example, nitrogen that you would use for an inert gas to add pressure to your breathable air, or some kind of fertilizer component for your agriculture. So I've coupled all of that under food. And lastly, communication. So of course, communication is the exchange of information, but also in terms of a local network, a monitoring system. So now let's start thinking about the economics. And for me, I've kind of interpreted economics, at least the subset of economics, that is resource management. Because perhaps, and I'm not an economist, but when we think about economics on Earth, maybe we think about these screens on Wall Street talking about stock share values, etc. What if we instead had the same amounts of detail and interest in monitoring our available resources, like levels of clean air or levels of fresh water available? You know, imagine if we put the same amount of effort into monitoring those critical resources as we did in other forms of what we would normally associate with the economy. So monitoring systems, IoT networks, local kind of, not perhaps control, we'll get to that, but certainly monitoring systems in terms of resource consumption, resource cycling, new resources being introduced to the system. Yeah, so that all falls under the communication. Back, okay. Okay. Yes. Well, okay, we're going to engage in a thought experiment. If my laptop will play along. Stable. So, I mean, I've mentioned that the probability of humans being on the moon and Mars in our lifetime is probable. The Artemis mission seems to be all systems go. Mars a bit more difficult to predict. But even as a thought experiment, Martian settlements, I believe, are a powerful tool for reimagining many aspects from society all the way down to, you know, basic infrastructure to manage and produce and cycle resources. So let's engage in a thought experiment of a Martian settlement, thinking about resource management and strategies and protocols and systems that could be thought of as economic systems for these kinds of communities. So what is Mars like? Let's look at what's available, because a settlement off planet will not be a closed system. So the space station, for example, except for resupply from Earth, and solar energy coming in and other particles coming from the sun, is largely a closed system. However, when you're on the moon or on a planet, the focus with the Artemis mission and of course with getting to Mars is going to be to extract resources from the environment. So a detailed understanding of what that environment looks like is critical, of course, before going. And luckily we have decades of experience collecting data on the surface of Mars, so we know these kinds of details. And we even have higher definition footage coming back from Mars. So I think it's becoming easier and easier for us to imagine what it's like on the surface of our neighboring planet because of the technology that we've been sending there continuously for decades. So the average temperature, -63. We've got mostly carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The pressure is around 1% of Earth, but the composition there is mostly carbon dioxide with trace molecular nitrogen and argon. We see rust orange colored on the planet because of the iron oxide on the surface, and there is more iron than on Earth in the mantle, and the gravity 38% of Earth. So the atmospheric resources, the solar energy, and the composition of the ground will be the resources that we will consider. Obviously extracting them is then the challenge with the available infrastructure. So what basic resources are required? As I said, we've got these categories, all encased in the form of shelter. So a shelter, yeah, you'd obviously want to pressurize it. Some level of protection from radiation means that perhaps settlements will eventually be underground, but initially kind of probably expandable modular habitats would be, first of all, you would live in the lander and then begin to expand a settlement on the surface before beginning to excavate, perhaps remotely by rovers in advance, or perhaps by the people when they arrive in conjunction with the rovers to perhaps live underground. Anyway, that's shelter to protect from the radiation. Power, so if you've watched The Martian, you know how critical that radioisotope thermoelectric generator was. So yeah, that's a good redundancy to have in your toolbox for power generation is a nuclear source. And depending how much radioisotopic material you bring with, you can already predict how long you're going to have power from that from. A solar array, good to put out the solar array on arrival. If you've brought batteries with you, great. But the lifetime of these technologies will be less in terms of the high levels of radiation on the surface of Mars because of the thin atmosphere. So in the long run, I would believe perhaps the local manufacture of photovoltaic panels would be possible. This would be great, especially if you can 3D print aspects of them from the silicon-rich sand that is to be found on Mars. That's one possibility, but in my mind, the batteries that need to support that solar array in times of sandstorms or during the night is not going to be practical, except maybe if you're relying on resupply from Earth, which is something you'd want to move away from. That puts you in a risky position if you're 200 million kilometers away from Earth waiting for resupply. Again, look back to The Martian. So fuel cells, I believe, whether you are using hydrogen fuel cells with oxygen, just as I said, in a regenerative process, or whether you are producing your own biofuel from your organic waste and using that in fuel cells. Obviously, methods of manufacturing all of these power generation systems is the next step in the independence for a Martian settlement. To what extent can we manufacture the infrastructure necessary for those power generation systems on Mars? So eventually you end up in a situation where you want a 3D printer that can print 3D printers, which I used to say as a joke, but I think they now exist. So things are moving along nicely. Yeah, so water is in situ. The Curiosity rover is able to analyze sand that it scoops up with its analyze the sand that it scoops up, and it's found 2 to 3% water, H2O ice, of course, at that low temperature and pressure. And yeah, below the surface a few meters. We've only gone as far as 3 ever, but we do predict that below the surface there may be larger deposits of water ice. So where the settlement is and the abundance of water nearby is critical. But the Curiosity rover, especially in old lake beds or ocean beds on Mars, we know there were large bodies of liquid water on Mars billions of years ago, between 3 and 4, depending on which research you may refer to. So H2O ice is there, but you're going to need a slightly more sophisticated set of activities to extract it, involving probably like a bulldozer attachment on a rover which dredges sand, then heating that sand mass to allow evaporation of that H2O, then storing it and filtering it, adding minerals, etc. And then you've got your drinking water as well as your H2O. Air, slightly easier. You can just suck in the atmosphere. So you've got CO2 on tap, basically, as long as you have some kind of pump. And of course, air could be extracted by electrolysis from either of those molecules. So food, this is something you don't want to forget behind, and that's your seeds, spores, eggs, tissue cultures, etc. We've seen recently in Singapore, and I think in Israel as well as in Tel Aviv, there are restaurants that are selling meat grown from tissue culture in labs. So genetically identical to the steak you might buy somewhere else. I think they started with chicken, actually. I'm not sure about steak, chicken. So that kind of commercial food production is already happening. So that's a good possibility for those who would miss a steak on Mars. And yeah, your seeds, your spores, your eggs are obviously critical for penicillin production. Spores, plants, you're going to bring a range of seeds in order to grow biomolecules for medicinal applications, obviously food and everything else. So your comms, you would want to have a kind of local network. And I think we've already seen, was it Nokia partnering with someone talking about building a network on the moon. Of course, the moon base will require its local comms as well as connectivity with Earth. On the moon, we can largely use the same protocols that we use for the internet on Earth because there's no time delay. But when we get to thinking about a solar system network, producing internet for people living in different parts of the solar system, that time delay becomes an issue. So you also need information storage capability at each of these repeater nodes. But yes, we of course already have communication with Mars, which gives us pictures like the ones you saw before and amazing video footage as well. So those are the resources available on the surface of Mars. So I don't mention the word waste here because I don't think waste will be a meaningful term for off-world settlements or research stations or whatever we would refer to them as. Rather, there would just be the notion of resource cycling. So how do we cycle resources? I've mentioned this regenerative fuel cell. Photosynthesis is, of course, a way that we can take carbon dioxide, produce oxygen and biomass at the same time. And microbial activity, I've talked a bit about that. So yeah, resource cycling would replace any notions of waste. Everything would be repurposed, and these are the processes by which we can do that. So here's a quick example in our thoughts experiment. We might want to choose between producing air from water or CO2, and the Perseverance rover's got a unit module called MOXIE, which is already producing oxygen, molecular oxygen from carbon dioxide from the ambient atmosphere on the surface of Mars, small amounts obviously, it's just a rover. So this is already demonstration complete. And of course on the ISS we've been using electrolysis to produce oxygen for some years. So which of these two methods of producing oxygen would you want to use? And that would depend on a number of other complex factors. So when we think about an economic system, you would want to have a decision-making tree of whether to do both or one or the other, depending on whether, for example, you have an excavation mission going on. Maybe you're busy digging the place for your habitat to be under the sand. That would be a great opportunity to use that sand to produce water. If not, perhaps you just want to pump carbon dioxide from outside. Of course, it's more energetically, you need more energy to split CO2 than to split water. So there would be some kind of decision-making tree behind whether you would do both or one or the other of these processes at any moment in the settlement. Just a quick example. Fuel production, for example. So SpaceX is already looking at producing fuel on the surface of Mars. Not only that, but building rockets that run on that fuel. Good idea. Before thinking about getting people to Mars, we would need to know that we have a way of storing fuel on the surface of Mars, because it's not feasible to take the fuel that you need for the return trip with on the trip there. So you've probably heard about the one-way trip to Mars with the Mars One project. I was one of those astronaut candidates. The project is not proceeding anymore. I'll talk about what I'm doing in a moment. But that one-way trip notion is now out the window. That was really a marketing campaign and a cost-saving measure. Because if you're serious about expanding beyond Earth rather than just planting a flag and coming back, as our history of space exploration has been, of course, you're going to manufacture fuel in situ. And luckily, Elon's one step ahead. So the Starship is built to run on methane. And that's the method of producing methane from water, then produce H2, combine that with CO2. Sunlight is a resource, and you can produce methane on Mars as well as water as a byproduct. So that's a good reaction, the Sabatier process to produce methane fuel on Mars. But perhaps in your settlement, you've got enough methane on store, or for whatever reason you want to produce another kind of fuel. So here's an alternative, 2,3-butanediol. Okay, I've only read that word. So that's another proposal. If you Google that fuel, you'll find a research paper. Another group has proposed that that's a method to make fuel on Mars, again using sugars, which the E. coli then consumes, and this fuel is an output. So again, which one of these two would be the preferred method? Of course, it depends what your rocket's running on for your trip back, and depending on what other kinds of fuel usages you have going on at the time. But these are just two examples of two different processes that you may want to run in parallel or choose between, and your resource management system should monitor and give recommendations as to which of these processes you may want to engage in at any time. So what would a resource management system look like? And now I'm not assuming AI in this. I'm not assuming that the resource management system would make any autonomous decisions, although we may give it some autonomy in terms of maintaining the basic life support systems to keep everyone alive. In terms of a model, which is what I'm hoping to arrive at in the end, not the model itself, but the description thereof, hopefully to the degree that someone gets excited to come and develop some technical detail together to make such a system. But here are some thoughts. So I should have put question marks next to these, but this my suggestions. Energy is a fundamental resource. So instead of entertaining the notion of tokens or money, why not use energy itself as the currency? So there's an energy price tag, as I've said, for producing breathable air from either H2O or CO2. So at any given moment, depending how much energy you have on store, how much wealth you have, you would be able to determine which projects you want to engage in or which life support system processes you want to turn on. Yeah, that's a thought. So what else would be necessary in a resource management system? You would want to have a detailed quantification of your initial conditions, which would include resources. So that could be things you've brought with you. So your radioisotope material for the thermoelectric generator. That's a predictable amount of energy that you've got on store, unless something goes wrong. Other resources, you can assume that you've got a X percentage of H2O in the sand around the settlement, so you're incorporating the in situ situation here as well for your resource availability. Yeah, what you can extract as well as what you have brought with you. Infrastructure, so that's your method of extraction. So you may modify your infrastructure may age and need repair. So your infrastructure would not be either a constant kind of in a constant quantity. You may have constant fluctuations in terms of what your infrastructure can do. You may modify your infrastructure, you may make it more efficient. So that's another kind of quantifiable element of your initial conditions that will undergo dynamics. So then, of course, you have your life support requirements, which would be determined by the number of people that you would have there, the kinds of activities they would be doing or need to do while they're there. Yeah, but your life support requirements would be, say, 2 liters of water a day, some percentage of oxygen so you don't pass out, that kind of thing. We may want to automate in the resource management system. Whereas if we have surplus energy, we wouldn't necessarily want to outsource decision making on what to do with the surplus energy to some kind of resource management system. We would rather just have a monitoring alert, there's surplus energy. People need to sit down and have a meeting and decide how to allocate that excess energy, whether it's going to the karaoke night or the jacuzzi or some other kind of science project that someone wants to work on. So initial conditions, you've quantified them in terms of your infrastructure, available resources, and the people and things you need to do. And then there's dynamics. So resource transformations pretty much encompass everything that happens to your resources. Energy is converted from one form to another. Energy enables the production of things like water, air, and food, and communication systems. So yeah, resource transformation and decision making. So you would need to sit down as a group and make some decisions, unless you decided to outsource those to some AI system. But decision making would also be part of the dynamics within the resource management system. So how do we formalize all of this? And as I've said, I'm not going to put up any formalization here because, yeah, this is a call for collaborators, for people who find this stuff interesting. But I've been chatting to Varoshan lately, who was doing his master's at the time in our group together with Francesco. And he has published this paper's on the archive, so feel free to have a look through there. So he uses elements from set theory, graph theory, and linear algebra to talk about a token exchange games where tokens carry value from past to future in economic exchanges. So here we may think, do we want to introduce the notion of tokens? Because once you have tokens, then you have the potential to hoard tokens at the expense of life support systems. Sound familiar? We have billions of people on Earth without access to clean water, clean air, nutritious food, never mind reliable power and communication systems, perhaps because of the potential to store money. So is the introduction of a token the initial trigger for that potential behavior to occur? And if so, do we want to introduce the notion of tokens? Nonetheless, I think this is a great formalism to consider. And for anyone from a quantum background, the linear algebra may get you thinking, can we put quantum in here somehow? So I'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, this could be a good basis on which to start formalizing these ideas. I mean, you've got a transformation matrix, a set of initial conditions. Every time interval, you get some transformation of resources to another state. You get red flags going off when your output is, too little water to survive for the next month or whatever. So interesting to consider that. So now let's move to some kinds of experiments we could do. Okay, so the idea is to have perhaps a model that can describe a resource management system, and we could try to optimize that model for different outcomes and see how that looks, given a very basic first start where we just look at power, water, food, and communication systems. Communication systems, sorry, let me elaborate, being critical obviously for software updates, 3D printing blueprints, counseling sessions, sharing data. So your communication systems are as critical as those three other resources. Perhaps I hadn't mentioned that, and of course requiring power to operate. So this is a tardigrade. For those of you who are not familiar, if you've seen the new Star Trek, they talk about tardigrades quite a bit. Maybe it's not the new one anymore. Yeah, so these creatures are the most extreme creatures known. They can survive all sorts of extreme temperatures, pressures, radiation levels, the vacuum of space, and they may already be living on the moon, because the private Israeli mission that crash landed onto the moon in, was it 2019 or some years before that, in fact had experimental, I don't know what they were encased in, but when the mission crash landed on the moon, it's possible that these tardigrades survived the impact. Some people say not possible, but anyway, these guys may already be living on the moon because of that. And this is the interesting part about doing private missions, is that they didn't get permission to actually send living systems from Earth to the moon. The mission crash landed. I'm not up to date with the details of that, but these tardigrades are the most extreme creatures known in terms of being able to thrive, not only inhabit, but thrive in extreme environments. So can we learn from extremophiles, or in particular, can we learn from colonies, microbial colonies of extremophiles, resource management systems? So can we do an economic biomimicry of creatures that can already collaborate to live in resource constrained environments that we may consider extreme? Can we learn any lessons from these systems? So on the one hand, extremophiles give us an idea of where we may find life in space. If we find, which we have done, microbes living a kilometer under the ice in Antarctica, this is a very good indication that there may be living systems under the ice crust of Europa, or Enceladus, the moon's in the outer solar system. But as well as I've mentioned now, can we learn from the interactions that we see with these microbial colonies living in extreme places in terms of looking at their interactions with each other and the environment? So the relevance of what I'm saying now remains to be seen, but it's perhaps interesting to think about the degree to which some extremophiles have gone to ensure their survival in extreme places. And green sulfur bacteria are an example of an organism that can survive. I mean, they're photosynthetic organisms. They metabolize sulfur, as you can tell from the name, not water. They don't enjoy being in an oxygenic environment, so in water is typically where they're found. But under the ocean, 2.5 kilometers is extreme, because they are very very few photons down there. They were found near a hydrothermal vent, so that's perhaps an energy source and certainly a source of minerals and other metabolic inputs for the system. But the extreme low light levels down here made this an interesting system for quantum biologists to study, and quantum coherence was detected in the energy transfer through the FMO complex, which is the light harvesting complex of these green sulfur bacteria. And perhaps this was one of the early papers triggering the revival in quantum biology studies, so experimental detection of quantum coherence in 2007 in this FMO complex, which you see there. So that just explains that the redundancy of power systems, or the ability to produce power, is so important that nature's gone to a quantum level to enable high extreme efficiency in that. And this FMO complex transfers photons that are absorbed from sunlight through the complex with almost 100% efficiency. So I'm not saying we're going to make our infrastructure quantum, because it's going to be big. It's not going to be quantum. But can we learn certain mechanisms in efficiency perhaps, and do like an analog of our power production capabilities in the same way that some photosynthetic systems have done, to make sure not a single photon is lost? What is the analogous sort of systems thinking for our economic system? Another experimental system from quantum biology is purple sulfur bacteria. Yeah, that's again an oxygenic photosynthesis. Let me just skip to the next slide. So this was some work we did together with Francesco during my PhD. So we showed that protective mechanisms, so power generation, critical, living systems go down to the quantum level to enable that they are able to generate power. In this case, we see a protective mechanism from cellular death. Okay, death of the whole community or individual is also something to be avoided, obviously. And again, nature's gone down to a quantum level, we propose, in terms of using a fast relaxing spin to prevent the formation of triplet states that can interact with oxygen and can kill the cell. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but you're welcome to read up on it. So the take homes here are power production needs to be highly efficient, and protective mechanisms need to be built into the system, and they need to be built in seriously, because obviously death is the one thing that you would want to avoid unnecessarily in a system in an extreme environment. So another thought from potential experimental systems, and if there are any biologists or microbiologists around, my knowledge on this is limited. These are just 3 ideas that popped up. Perhaps we can do more simple kind of experiments on a Petri dish. When we have our model of what an economic system could look like, we could add a certain amount of energy and nutrients to a microbial population and observe the growth and see, compare our model to such a system, which we can do simply in the lab. Not sure exactly how this may have relevance, but I came across it and it's beautiful. So these are the patterns. I'll bring up the picture in more detail now, but microbial colonies form complex patterns under resource constraints, which means limited nutrient availability plus limited power availability. Then we see these highly complex structures emerging because of cooperative behavior and communication pathways. So these microbes will move along nutrient gradients and communicate with each other through various mechanisms and form, perhaps the beauty of the pictures is not so much what we focus on, but I think the idea that complex structure emerges in resource constrained environments is perhaps some inspiration of just how much effort we should be putting into things like resource management systems, where instead on Earth we sit with an economic system that perhaps we've inherited and haven't thought much about whether it's optimal or not. So there's a closer look at some of those pictures. And certainly we are in resource constrained environments here on Earth in the way that I've explained, billions of people without access to even these basic resources that I've referred to. So can we do better with developing complex structures that enable our cooperative, interactive colony of humans on Earth to reach a better system? And that's why I say the points I mentioned on Mars was kind of a thought experiment. Even as a thought experiment, I think thinking about setting up a settlement beyond Earth is a powerful tool to reimagine how we may shift our current ways of doing things on Earth to a more sensible, let's be honest, way of structuring our society. So, as I said, the technical detail is not here yet, and I look forward to hearing ideas from any of you or anyone online on how we may do that. So why haven't I done any technical detail? Thanks to Francesco for having me out here as a call for collaborators rather than a report of any results. That's because I've been working on another experimental context where we can implement and evaluate the kind of economic systems that we may come up with. So as Francesco mentioned, in 2019, I established an organization called Proudly Human. And the flagship project of the organization is the Off-World Project. So the idea is to prepare for extreme environments, whether on Earth or beyond. Let's admit it, things on Earth are not getting less extreme. And doing habitation experiments in a range of some of the most extreme locations on Earth to look at the technology infrastructure and how to optimize the efficiency of that, as well as looking at the community of people that would be interacting and engaging and existing on that life support system and the dynamics within that community as well. Because of course, what I've talked about now in terms of a resource management system hasn't included the complex and often problematic addition of humans into the mix. But that was basically the basis for this system that we would want to design, would be assuming the absence of humans, get it right, compare it to microbial colonies, then think about what happens when we add humans, and modeling human behavior. If any of you are social scientists, you can correct me, but modeling human behavior is difficult. I think, in my opinion, it's easier to do it and see what happens. So that's the idea. We will take around 10 people to each of these type of locations, a desert-like environment where water management is critical to the survival of the community, a polar environment where the absence of sunlight during winter makes other forms of energy generation necessary. The cold temperatures in Antarctica and the Arctic Circle become comparable with Mars. So plumbing systems, etc., can be tested there. And then a submarine environment, which is perhaps the closest analog we can get to being in space, where you need to put on a suit in order to explore the area beyond the settlement, and where you are localized to the habitat with the team that you are working with in that extreme environment. And that's in preparation for the teams of people who will travel to the moon and Mars in our lifetimes. Yeah, in preparation. So let me explain a bit more. So this is just some visuals on the location scout we did to Namibia. And the reason why you see these stark parallels between the landscape in Namibia and Mars, and I think you'll agree as you see more of the footage, is because the Namibian desert was also once under the ocean. So that rock you just saw there certainly looks like water has impacted it. We see erosion patterns, coast shoreline-like patterns, canyons, pebble-like structures, even in areas that are now extremely dry. So that is analogous with Mars. Actually, Namibia is the oldest desert on the planet, 55 million years old. And being our next door neighbor, we were able to go there during lockdown. And logistically, if our power systems fail in Namibia, we're not going to die. So this is a great entry-level experiment to do in the Namibian desert, where water management will be critical. So this video is on YouTube if you want to see the rest. But really stunning landscape. We identified the location where we would actually want to do the experiment, and awkwardly, the chief of the Tokna community, who you saw a moment ago, his mom actually lives over the dune. So we will certainly be interacting with local communities that already are able to thrive in these kind of environments, hopefully learning from community dynamics, etc. Sharing type of economy, which is necessary for survival in such harsh conditions. Yeah, but that's Namibia. That's on YouTube if you want to see the rest. Water management will be at the heart. So let's look back to the categories we've already been looking at. Now this is practical. This is what we will take to Namibia. A solar array. Perhaps we will do away with batteries if we have fuel cells for generating power at night. Perhaps we'll have wind turbines or other methods of generating power. An atmospheric water generator will be critical to generate our water from the air. It is not a very humid environment in Namibia. However, a lot of the insects and other animals actually survive off the mist that comes from the ocean, even as much as 100 kilometers inland, collecting the droplets on their legs, the beetles, etc. So there is some ambient humidity. We will extract that with atmospheric water generators. I mean, this is super old school tech, you know, put a bottle of water in the fridge and then take it out the fridge and you already see condensation forming on the outside. That's the basis of this technology. It's not quantum computing. It's been around a while. And why are we not using these kind of systems in crisis zones like Durban, Tonga, where the volcano erupted and made drinking water difficult to access? These are off-the-shelf boxes about a meter cube. Our partner in Cape Town sells also big units, which can be used for hospitals or shopping malls. So these technologies exist. They're rather power intensive because of the fan and the pump to keep the compartment cool where the water is condensed, and also to suck the air in from outside. But Cirrus, a Cape Town-based company, is working on a gas-powered unit, which would work off a gas canister. So that would be perfect for our purposes. We're hoping to have that ready by the time we go. Wastewater management. So typically this is done in large volumes, like a whole town or a whole city will have a wastewater management plant. So what we have is a unit not so much smaller than this table, which will process 1,000 liters of water a day, like 2 by 1 by 1 meters. And that's being developed by our partners Swirltex in Canada, running on 300 watts. So did you know that that technology exists? We can process any waste, solids, liquids, kitchen cuttings, etc., pass through the system at 300 watts, can generate clear water. We're not going to drink it because we've got our atmospheric water generator, but we're going to use it for showering, agriculture, and washing, any other purposes. Our wastewater management system. Then our agriculture obviously requires power for the pumping of the water, not so much the sunlight in the Namibian context, obviously, but in the Arctic, yes. And you can see all the arrows, how this all feeds in. The IoT system will be monitoring how much energy we're generating from the solar array, any other sources of power that we put in construction, how much we're generating from the atmospheric water generate, obviously depending on the hour of the day. At dusk and dawn are the best times to do that. Our wastewater management system performance, how much water we're using for agriculture, and monitoring things like heart rate, monitoring things like cortisol. Like this is only recently possible because of wearables. You can now even get a patch that measures cortisol levels. We can do urine analysis to look at hormone levels of males and females to see how that impacted community dynamics. We're going to monitor everything we can. So monitoring systems for resource management, seeing how much food people consume, depending on how many hours of manual labor they've been doing perhaps during the day. All of these kind of factors we can take into account. But in terms of the basic management system I've described, these are the categories we'd look at. And we want to see if we can produce food in 40 days. It's 10 people, 40 days in the desert. What kind of crops can produce biomass on that short time frame? So maybe like micro herbs and things to add to rice or pap that you brought with. Yeah, we'll have to interpolate between the food that we tried to grow and obviously the food we brought with as we would on arrival in a different location. So in the desert, water management would be the key factor. In 2019, just before lockdown, I managed to make a trip to Antarctica, which would be a more extreme version than the North Arctic region. So there is a all year round airport in Svalbard, an island off Norway. So that would probably be our location, but this is an extreme example. So this is actually a hotel in Antarctica. You might ask about the treaty, but that's not a discussion for another day. Yep, there's a high-end hotel operating in Antarctica. So I went out there to see how they run logistics. Okay, there's some fun parts that we did. And this is obviously in summer. So very pleasant. It was the hottest summer on record, and all the clothes that I had painfully forked out for were not even necessary. My jacket was too hot. So this is not the conditions you're going to be looking forward to in winter. And being a luxury hotel, they have airplanes coming in from Cape Town every day with fresh food, so they're definitely not growing anything out there. And in fact, they burn generators all day long with A1 jet fuel to provide power, although the sun doesn't set. So not exactly the infrastructure that we are going to repeat in our mission, but this is a potential backup base for our experiments. So some of you may know people who go to Antarctica and do research. The Sanai 4 South African base is recently renovated a few years ago, looking great. People do spend the winter there. An important part about building a base from scratch is that you need two. So that was an important aspect from one of our advisors. Always have a backup base in Antarctica in case your primary base burns down. It's -40 in winter if you're in the interior. You can't survive for very long. Modern humans can't survive for very long. Let's say in the heroic era of Antarctic exploration, Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen, yeah. I would have longed to have lived in those times where there was no comms and you just get on a ship and go down to Antarctica and live off seal blubber and build your shack from the wood that you brought with the carpenters that you brought with, while doing watercolor sketches of the landscape to record. Things are slightly different now. But yeah, the categories remain the same, and in a place which is -40 or less, obviously your power generation is really critical, while your water management depends on power, but not necessarily your water is not really a constraint. The third category, underwater, and so as far as I know, there's only one underwater habitat on Earth, and that's off the Florida Keys, the Aquarius Reef Base. I didn't get to go down to the Aquarius Reef Base, it's 10 meters under, but astronauts use this location to train for the International Space Station. It's built as an analog of the International Space Station. So NASA and ESA and other space agencies use it annually to train astronauts. And there was a quick video here. So currently the underwater base, built in the 80s, has pipes bringing signal from the land, bringing water from the land, and bringing power from the land. So they're not desalinating down there. They're not using water flow to generate energy. They're not using atmospheric water generators to remove humidity from the base. So these are technologies we will bring to augment the existing infrastructure in the base. Yeah, a really solid team. Tom Potts, who I met with in Florida, runs the program, and he's actually been with the program since he was a master's student in the 80s. So he's really closely tied with the space under the ocean and a lover of the ocean. So a great team there, and we hope to use this space for a world record of 78 days, which is the duration of a return trip to Mars if we use plasma propulsion technology, which has not yet been tested. But if so, in case you're wondering, the trip to Mars currently is around 7 months. If you were on the Perseverance rover mission, 6 to 7 month trip. But with this plasma propulsion technology, we may be able to move from Earth orbit, not from the surface of Earth. Plasma propulsion technology could be used from Earth orbit to Mars, accelerating at 1G half the way, decelerate, reorient the spaceship, decelerate at 1G for the rest of the duration, so you don't have any issues about the low gravity environment. And arriving to Mars in 78 days. So we'll attempt to do the return trip to Mars under the ocean in this Aquarius Reef Base, also making a new world record, which is currently 73 days. Apparently the reason you would tap out at 73 days is the levels of humidity, easily solved with an atmospheric water extractor. So that's what we will bring to the party. So as I've said, yeah, this is a rather dramatic picture of Earth without oceans, but I don't think anyone can argue that things could get better or less extreme on Earth anytime soon. I think we're headed for more extreme times. Luckily, we've got decades of space exploration technology experience, because these are precisely the technologies that we are going to need to do to become more resource efficient on Earth. So there's a really nice parallel between the endeavor to expand beyond Earth and the endeavor to alleviate poverty on Earth. And that's where I think the role of Africa can be really clear in joining these two agendas in terms of developing robust, cheap, efficient, well-integrated and efficient and optimal way technologies to provide basic resources for people, whatever planet they're on. And that set of technologies I showed around the water management have all existed for decades. There's no rocket science there. There's really no excuse going forward that we don't implement these systems, whether it's for 1 million Syrian refugees in the desert, whether it's in Madagascar, where they've had critical famine because of lack of rain, etc., or on the surface of the moon or Mars. The same tech is required to support human communities wherever we are. Let's remember that both Mars and Venus once had liquid water on the surface, so perhaps this picture is not so extreme. How are we going to manage our resources better in order to restabilize our life support system, which due to our activity is not in a great state right now? And I hope I didn't go too much over time, but we did have some technical issues in the beginning, so thanks so much for your attendance and your attention online. If you want to get in touch with me, just contact me through my website. If you want to read more on proudlyhuman, proudlyhuman.com. And yeah, a call for collaborators, whether you want to join the experiments. We are still growing our community from which we will draw each team to go to each of these places. We'll also repeat these experiments, or whether you would like to look at formalizing the resource management model, or whether you would be interested in running experiments on microbial populations. Yeah, all those options are available. Thank you very much.